Hello and welcome everyone, wherever you may be. My name is Peter Jagan and I am hosting Data Founders, a series of interviews with entrepreneurs and investors who work on data science related startups. It's an interview number 10 and I'm talking to Barr Moses, who is a co-founder and the CEO of Monte Carlo, a data reliability platform. It's a pleasure to have you here, Barr.
Thanks, great to be here. Lucky number 10.
Yes. I hope it will become our lucky number. So probably let's start from the early days of your career. I know that you served in the Israeli Air Force as a commander of an intelligent data analyst unit. And before you worked at Bain, a consulting company. So I'm sure everyone is curious how those experiences influenced you as a founder and where you are today as a founder.
Yeah, so I was born and raised in Israel, and so I was drafted to the Israeli Air Force. I actually wanted to be a pilot, but I didn't get accepted, which is a fun fact, which is how I sort of found myself in the data space, actually. And so at a very young age, I was about 18 and a half years old, and I was responsible for a group of 18 years old. Responsible for their kind of, training and well-being and all that good stuff. And at such a young age, I had no training. I had definitely, I didn't have a degree, no professional experience, let alone management training. And so I learned at a very young age how, if you actually give folks kind of a tremendous amount of responsibility, people actually rally around that. And can really have sort of outstanding impact. So, we worked in a unit that provided data that actually ended up sort of helping saving lives in the 2006 period. And we actually got commended with an award for outstanding performance. And what I personally learned from that is that if you give people the opportunity to make an impact with this responsibility, and if they have the right motivation, then they can do great things, even if they've never done it before or didn't have sort of the official training to do that. And so, taking that lesson into startup world, hiring sort of folks who are very bright and talented and capable can make a huge impact on a company, even if they don't have, sort of the typical background or the specific professional experience that you'd expect. Actually, sort of a diversity of experiences can oftentimes breed sort of a stronger culture or even stronger impact and results. So that was certainly kind of, impacts from that time. Later on, I moved to the Bay Area and actually several years after joined Bain Company as a consultant and worked with companies ranging from tech companies to private equity, supporting M&A deals. And the timelines there were very, very short. It could be 2 to 3 weeks on average. And, you could work on a totally variety of different industries. So one day could be, helping a semiconductor company that wanted to enter the IoT market with the new acquisition of wearable technologies. This was like the early days of like Fitbit and such. I don't know if you remember that back then. There was crazy.
Have one in my
okay. So this was back when we didn't even know if this was going to be a market or not, right? And he basically had like 2 weeks to get up to speed on the market and decide whether an acquisition was sort of the right acquisition or not, just as an example. And so in a very short amount of time, you learn a lot about a new industry. You actually collect a lot of data and then need to make sort of very strong business decisions based on impartial data. And so as a founder, one that sort of helped me, kind of get up to speed on new topics in a short period of time. Like for example, I need to know, about sort of every function of our business, right? Even a function that I haven't done before. And the second thing that I learned from that time was how to really make decisions with limited information, right? Like someone told me, strategy is actually making decisions with very limited data. And as a founder, especially an early stage founder, you're really making most of your decisions with very limited information. Questions like what product to build, what customers to go after, what market, what part of the market you're going to tackle. All of those things are things that you really don't have data, and yet you have to act with conviction and get people to follow you to do that. So that's a little bit how I think about those
Mhm.
sort of different experiences.
Mhm, mhm. And my understanding that after Bain, there was also an important moment in your career. You were working with a customer success software development company, right? So when you led teams responsible for data and for analysis. And correct me if I'm wrong, exactly there you spot the idea that became Monte Carlo, right? Or not really?
Yeah, so shortly after that, I joined Gainsight. So Gainsight is the customer success, customer data platform, which works with companies to help them, sort of use their customer base to propel growth in their organization. And at Gainsight, I had the fortune of working with wonderful people, helping create the customer success category, and also building the internal team that was responsible for customer data, which we called Gainsight on Gainsight, because we were basically using, our product internally for us. Just sort of short for, we call it Gong, like Gainsight on Gainsight, for short. It was like the Gong team. And throughout that experience, as a company, we became very data driven. And so we were collecting way more data. There were way more data sources that we were working with. Our pipelines became more complex. Our transformations became more complex. And the consumers that we served grew in size and importance as well. So we had way more people in the organization actually relying on data. And my personal experience there was that bad data was just a thing that we had to live with. Like, I would just wake up every morning. I'm sure, sort of data scientists across the world can resonate with this, but you kind of wake up, for like the daily fire drill, and you're like, okay, what's broken today, right? Which model is not working right now? Or, what sort of consumer is asking about like this sort of data set that like seems to be outdated, et cetera. And at some point, like we just started to like manually vet these reports and models to make sure that the numbers check out. And that just seemed insane to me. I was like, we were like a small and mighty team of like a few folks, but like we didn't have time to like manually vet this. And I realized that if we wanted to get data driven as an organization and as an industry more broadly, we need to change our approach. Like it's not going to work for us to continue doing this.
Mm-hmm.
And so actually I sort of ask myself, like, sometimes in these situations you're like, am I crazy? Is the world crazy? Like what exactly is going on? Right. And so I actually sort of wanted to kind of take a step back and, understand what folks are doing out there. And so I spoke to hundreds of data leaders, asking them about their biggest pain points, ranging from small startups like large organizations. I literally just cold call people and I was like, hey, what's keeping you up at night? And this thing just came up again and again. And I learned that it was, this idea that like, people are just surprised by bad data. The interesting thing is that oftentimes data teams are the last to know when data breaks, right? They hear about it from someone else who's consuming the data. So oftentimes there are silent failures that happen. Maybe, a job was completed, but, the data was just, everything was null in the data that was passed, right? If you're not proactively checking for those things, proactively making sure that you have a good understanding of the health of your data, oftentimes you're surprised by that. And so I, experienced that personally and also saw that so many folks are sort of suffering from this, and also that it's detrimental for their companies specifically. And so that, got me really curious about why in the world are we acting this way, right? It just seems like something was off.
And was there a particular moment when did you realize that aha moment? That's an idea for a startup, or it's more mostly like accumulation of different talks, conversations that led you to the feeling that there is something there, that you were onto something.
Yeah, I think with every conversation that I had, my conviction grew stronger and stronger. And actually, interestingly, so before I started the company, I actually experimented with a number of different ideas for starting a company. I wanted I wanted to convince myself that it's a worthwhile idea, and I knew that I was going to want to convince customers and employees and investors and sort of other folks in it. And so I needed to get that conviction first. And so, in sort of these conversations, every conversation that I had continued to solidify that. And when, there were other ideas that I was working on, like I would call people up to talk about them and like nobody would pick up the phone, like nobody would call me back. I was like, oh my God, nobody cares about this idea. How am I going to create a company around it? Right. But this particular idea, like customers or sort of people would call me before I would even call them. And there was sort of this strong pull to continue the discussion on this. And people also, you could tell that people cared about this. Like, as data people, like it's sort of ironic, but like our profession is sort of relies on our ability to deliver reliable data. That's the whole point of data, that it's accurate and you can rely on it. And yet reality is so far from that. And that's very personal, right? And I think through those conversations is how I kind of got that conviction that, one, it's something that is an unsolved problem that's very painful to people. And two, that the market is very big because literally every company runs into it. And if you think about our world, every company is becoming a data company today. Those that aren't are being left behind. If they haven't, they will. And so I just couldn't imagine a world where there wasn't a solution to this problem.
Yeah. And I guess now it's a great time to switch to the solution. So we talked about the problem, about the pain that you have seen, about the conviction that you have built. So tell us a bit more about Monte Carlo. My understanding is that you are guys building a kind of entire new category, maybe. So expand about that, please.
Yeah, definitely. So, so our mission is to accelerate the adoption of data in the world by minimizing data downtime. So I'll start by explaining what data downtime actually is. So data downtime is a term that we coined to describe those times in which sort of data breaks, if you will. So the proper definition is periods of time when data is missing, inaccurate, or just otherwise erroneous. And as I mentioned, like I've seen this kind of regardless of industry, costly problem, where literally companies sort of lose millions of dollars firefighting and, because of sort of bad data. And why do we actually call it data downtime, or like where does that corollary come from? I think that's important because that's sort of what is at the root of what Monte Carlo is. So data downtime draws on the corollary of application downtime. So if you think about the last couple of decades, as the software industry has made tremendous progress in developing application monitoring or application right diligence around application downtime. Something that didn't exist 20 years ago and does exist today because we rely on applications so much, right? Software is driving all areas of our business. I think data is the new software. And as a result, data is now powering all of our applications and our operations, ranging from like digital products to daily decision-making to just the operations of the company. And if you think about that, that means if you believe that trend is going to continue to happen, that means that we need to start treating data downtime with the same diligence that we have been treating application downtime. And so Monte Carlo is really focused on helping organizations restore trust in their data. We believe that data teams should be the first to know about data downtime, not the last and not after a month, but rather be the first to know and in real time. We also believe that it's incredibly hard to know and understand data downtime today. And so we help organizations identify the root cause, in minutes, not in months. Oftentimes what happens is that data organizations learn about a problem months later, and then it takes them a couple of weeks just to understand what was the problem and why. And the company has already sort of lost millions of dollars in the process. So we help reverse that. And then the third thing that we help organizations do is actually prevent data downtime to begin with. So with the right sort of information at your fingertips, you can oftentimes actually prevent these from happening. And I'll give an example. A specific example of how data downtime happens is when someone on some team, let's say like an engineer, makes a change to your website. And that change on your website has unintended consequences downstream on a particular report or data set that your marketing team is using to make, is using for a campaign. And so that change has now impacted the ROI on that marketing campaign. And so in sort of today's world, this entire process happens without the engineering team and the marketing team having this communication. What we help do is make it very easy for everyone to know that this change was made upstream. We also help engineers know the impact of what is going to happen if they make that change in their website, so they can understand what are the reports or what's all the data assets that are going to be impacted as a result. And once you have that information, we can find that people can actually move fast, build more things, improve their velocity as an organization, and not break their data, meaning still have trust in their data, if that makes sense.
It's interesting that you mentioned this example, and even in this just single example, there were multiple personas mentioned, right? You have marketing people, you mentioned engineers. On top of my head, I would mention like compliance people, cybersecurity people, maybe machine learning research people. So for startups, usually there is a challenge to define who is the primary personas, right? With whom to talk first. Who are these people for you, and how did you arrive to these people? What was your framework to identify them? I guess it will be useful for every founder to learn about that.
Great question. And I think some of the challenges in the early days really are around sort of problem definition. And one of the interesting things about the problem of data downtime, you're right, it touches on everyone in the organization, right? I'll add to that, like, engineering, data analytics, product management, data governance, really the list of people that sort of touch data so long. And in the early days of startup, you really can't solve for all of those people, right? And so what we actually did is we started with trying to understand who are the people in the organization who are impacted most by data downtime, and why, right? And understanding that. And there's a few different personas. The main personas or main sort of folks that we work with are data engineers and data analysts. And they have different titles in that, but sort of data engineers are often sort of folks who are kind of responsible for the infrastructure and responsible for kind of the jobs and sort of building the pipelines. And data analysts are oftentimes those who are either building or consuming the data and using that to power digital products or to make decisions. And I'd say that the sort of the way that we've sort of kind of identified these folks for us has been from the very, very early days, speaking to organizations where we can identify a particular pain point of data downtime, and then working very closely with them on a solution. So our approach was find customers as soon as you can, as early as you can, and actually build the product with them. So we were very fortunate to have awesome design partners from day one who sort of opened up to us about their challenges, and we could actually see, like, okay, when was the last time they had data downtime? Why did that happen? Someone made a change upstream. Okay, how did they catch that? They saw that because they had an unusual number of nulls. Okay, what are they doing now to troubleshoot that? What are the steps that they're taking? We literally sort of became like these detectives, right? To really understand like how people are working and how they're thinking, and then understand how we can add value and impact in sort of in sort of solving their problems. So it's just through sort of close work with customers from the very early days.
You just described, I guess, an amazing picture of a customer development process as well, asking a lot of correct questions, right questions that definitely pass the mom's test, right?
It's a good book.
It's an amazing book, I would say, and I'm glad to hear that you as a founder who actually built something can confirm that, because I'm not a founder, I'm not a product manager, but I felt that it's a very nice book as well.
Yeah, I actually, at the beginning, I did the complete opposite. And then I read the book and I was like, oh shit, I've been doing everything wrong. And then I totally changed my approach and readopted what was in that book. And so, yeah, I totally agree and highly recommend it as well.
No, that's really a great book. And maybe the one part that is less covered in the book, how actually get hold of these people? What was your approach to finding them? Maybe through your previous companies where you worked, or through your friends, etc. How did you actually identify these wonderful design partners?
Yeah, so for me, it was very important from the beginning to actually sort of per the book, per the, what the book recommends is to not go with sort of my network and my family.
Mm-hmm.
Just for folks listening, sort of what this book talks about is that, there's a certain group of people in your life. It could be your parents, it could be your friends, it could be your colleagues, who are not very objective when it comes to evaluating your ideas.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you, give them a prompt around a particular idea that you're working on, even if the idea is complete shit, they might still tell you, oh, it's the best idea ever. You're amazing. Go forth and do it. Just because it's human nature to do that. And so the book proposes that in order to truly trust an idea, you need to find people who don't have that bias. And so I really took that to heart, and found people who owe me nothing, who don't know me at all, and who, to the best of my ability, didn't have that bias. Now, I would say, as I mentioned, with other ideas that I worked on when I did that, nothing clicked. So just the fact that I talked to people that I didn't know didn't help me. So I would say you need to find people, or for me, what worked was finding people who, had nothing to do with me personally and could give me an objective view. I also needed to make sure that we're working on something that matters, that's worth solving for them, right? Because if it wasn't something that matters, then they wouldn't spend time with me. And so I wouldn't get there were some ideas where I would try to get on a call with someone who didn't know me, and they didn't have time for me, and they were like, I'll talk to you later. But when it came to this thing mattered to them. Data downtime was a problem for them, and so they wanted to talk about it. So that was one sort of aspect. And I think the second is, I had to build sort of trust and credibility in this space, right? Through getting to know people, getting through the community. That was a very important part. And then maybe the last sort of thought here is once we sort of wanted to sort of, past the interview part or past the research question, the hardest part is to get people to actually try out your product, right? With folks who don't even know you. And so what we've optimized in the very early days is building a product that makes it very easy to engage with us, incredibly easy. We've invested a ton of engineering effort in making onboarding extremely easy. Security is well thought out. Our architecture is sort of security first. And so that helped us remove as many of the barriers for data organizations to work with us from day one. So we basically what do we need to do from the very beginning to make it incredibly easy for people who we don't know, who actually have this problem? It matters to them. It's worth solving it for them. Now let's see if we can get a foot in the door and try to help solve them. And you earn that by building a product that's easy to use.
So that's great. So you were able to onboard some customers from this research part into actually trying the real product. What would be your framework around moving them further in the pipeline, like trials, demos, and then maybe contracts? How do you think about that, and what would be your advice for someone who builds a data science tool maybe, or a platform, regarding actually converting customers into paying customers?
Yeah. So, building on sort of this previous example that I gave, in the very early days, you have very limited resources, right? You can probably only solve one of those problems, right? You can't both solve, onboarding and, deployment and getting them to pay and getting them to renew, right? You're not going to solve the whole chain, right? And I remember, in sort of the early days of the company, I used to have a slide that actually shows the different parts of the chain and explain how we're gonna tackle them one by one, right? And we're gonna go all in on the first, and then go all in on the second, and just start chipping away at it. And so the very first thing that we did was how do we get people to talk to us, right? And that came down to having something that they care about, and having something interesting to say about it. And then the second was, how do we get them to try out a product? And the only thing that mattered there was to make it onboarding extremely easy. So like make the product the easiest to use, right? Like our implementation time is like 19 minutes or something like that on average. And so to your point, like what's the next step after that, right? The most important thing, the next step after that is actually seeing value. So, gone are the days when people implement a product and then they wait like 6 to 9 months to actually see value. It was clear to us that if people have gone through like the first 2 steps with us, we probably have like maybe a few days to show them value, right? Like after a few days, like that's it. Like, I was sort of, as a person who like led a data team, I had like 0 attention spans, like all these vendors were trying to get at me, right? And if someone was talking to me, like you probably had like a day or 2 and then like, that's it. Right. And so it was clear to me that we needed to find ways to show value extremely easy. So we went all in on that. And actually what we did was we developed a way to generate value through our product without actually getting input from the organization. So particularly what we do is we have a machine learning based model or sort of kind of module in our product that helps you glean insights from your data, specifically identify data downtime without any input. And so you can get started immediately with just, a very quick onboarding, and then you start seeing some value incredibly fast. And that's something that we hear from our customers today. After a couple of days of onboarding, they already have ability into things that they just didn't have before. And they're really sort of wowed by that. And so we invested a lot in making sure that they get value very, very quickly. And so that actually brought us to a point where customers were offering, they were like, hey, like this is giving us great value. We want to pay for this service. And so the conversation around like payment and value and all that stuff becomes way easier if you're actually focused on delivering value and solving the specific problem that's at hand with them. So we were just laser focused on how do we make our customers' lives incredibly easy and make them, as happy as we can as fast as possible.
And it seems like it became very organic then, right? To move with customers to another stages. One interesting moment that frequently is discussed by data science founders is actually how deeply a founder should be involved into all of that. Because some people say, oh, let's outsource sales. Let's outsource that to somebody who is much more experienced than we are. We are data scientists. We don't do that. So I'm curious to learn what was kind of level of your involvement and what do you think about structuring this activity? Do you need somebody else to do that, or maybe founder should to do that? These kind of things.
Yeah, I mean, it's very hard to build a great business on your own, right? That's not how great businesses are being built, right? Like great things are built by organizations, right? Not by sort of individual people. I very much believe in that. And so, I'm incredibly grateful for the amazing team that we have at Monte Carlo that, is building, the data reliability category as we speak, right? And so in general, I would say like nothing is done alone on your own. That being said, in the very, very early days, for founders who perhaps not yet raised money or just in the early days of, figuring out what you want to work on, I think it's sort of you have to sort of push the limits of what you feel comfortable doing. And there is value to, for founders doing a little bit of the what you call 0 to 1 stage, right? So like getting the first customer or even the first 10 customers. Those are things that impact all the decisions that you make later. Like, for example, who are you going to hire to run your sales team? What kind of go-to-market motion will you have? What kind of marketing do you need? What kind of product leadership do you need? All of those decisions are really determined by what you're doing in the very early days. And so gleaning those learnings, I personally think is very, very important and helpful. And I'm probably extreme on this side, but I've invested a ton in customer development even before we wrote a single line of code. So we actually like flip the model. So instead of starting with a product and then finding customers that fit with it, we started with the customers and then built the product that would help serve them. If that makes sense.
Yeah, to me at least it does make a lot of sense. And if we fast forward to the current stage of Monte Carlo, the company is quite mature. And what I've noticed that at the website, you have different solutions for different, let's call them verticals, maybe marketing, financial services, retail, etc. I guess there is always a discussion. Should you aim for these verticals, or should you build something very horizontal engineering and generic and not mention any specific vertical? And then there is a discussion about priorities between these verticals. So what's your framework about that? And when there is a sense to go for specific verticals, and when there is no sense, for instance, in your opinion?
Yeah, and in general, I think for a founder or CEO, your sort of biggest lever is focus.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, it's something that I try to do even more every day, and my team knows about it. That they're like, I'm always a person who's trying to push us to be more focused and more narrow. And I think, we need to do an even better job at that. So I would say, by default, narrower is better. In the early days, it's incredibly hard to do otherwise. On the other hand, for us, because we are creating a new category, we aren't replacing a product that already exists out there.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not like there's a set of customers that's already using a product and we're offering, a solution that's replacing it, right? And so we needed to identify who is this set of customers for which this problem is significant, at least in today's world. And so we started, actually, just quite frankly, we actually shot in all directions. So we just tested out the market, engaged with everyone from like 10-person companies to like Fortune 50s, right? And that actually worked surprisingly well for us. We learned a lot. We were lucky to have sort of inroads with a very broad spectrum of customer, but we also realized that we can't do everything. And so, across these industries, there are things that are very, very common. So for example, we work mostly with cloud first companies, mostly with sort of cloud technology, for example. And that can be across industries. We work with a very specific persona, as I mentioned, like the persona that cares about data downtime. So, for example, if they have like data in their title, if there's like a senior person in an organization that's responsible for data, that probably means that data matters to their organization and they're more likely to have experienced data downtime. And so, even though it may seem like there's sort of this wide range, there's a very narrow set of commonalities across that allows us to serve this broad base of customers.
And do you think there is a sense in kind of trying to quantify an ideal profile of a customer? For instance, I constantly hear from someone in advertising business that you can build a profile of an ideal customer, let's say, based on the amount of the budget. If they spend less than X on Facebook, we just don't work with them. Something like this. And there are other examples. Do you think founders need to move towards this quantification, or it may be less quantifiable and more maybe qualitative, profiling, let's say?
So I think I'd say it depends. I think you do need to convince yourself that the market that you're working on is big and is growing. So for us, for example, Snowflake that just IPO'd recently was the largest software IPO of all times, right? That's a strong indication that the data space is becoming more and more important and is probably one that I'm excited to bet on. So you do need to have strong conviction, I think, in the size of the market overall. That being said, there's two catches. One, you often see companies actually increasing their TAM over time as they move into adjacent areas, as they release sort of new products. So what you it's actually choosing something narrower at the beginning doesn't necessarily mean that you can't expand later. For us in particular, we actually are creating a new category. And so that means that it's very, very hard to quantify in the early days, right? The way that we think about this is, or sort of the market that we're creating, we call it sort of data observability, right? And what does this mean? I talked a little bit about data downtime and sort of how that is a corollary to application downtime. data observability is an application to observability in DevOps. So in the same way that sort of any engineering organizations has, a solution like New Relic or AppDynamics or Datadog that they use in order to create observability into their health of their applications. And they use those solutions in order to make sure that their apps are up and running. And, you can sort of rest well at night knowing that. Data organizations, in my opinion, should have the exact same thing. And that's what we've built. We've built New Relic, but for data, which gives data organizations the power to know when their data is down or when there's data downtime, when their data is not healthy. And so in my mind, any engineering team that has a solution like that, it's a no-brainer. And in the same way, like it's a no-brainer that any data organization should have something like this. I don't understand how we don't already have something like this. But, in the same sense, there isn't a category right now out there that you can quantify. There's one that, as a founder, there's a set of sort of hypotheses that you can list out that you would believe in. For example, I believe that data will become more important 3 to 5 years today.
Yeah.
I believe that every organization will be relying on more and more data sources and more data consumers, for example. And then the third one could be, I believe that manual checking of data quality and data lineage is not going to scale as these first two hypotheses emerge, and therefore we will need an automated way to think about health of data. If you believe these three hypotheses, then I believe that in this market. And so I really think about it in terms of like, what do I need to believe to get excited about this? That's sort of my framework.
Interesting approach. So if you feel that a potential customer believes in these similar things that you believe in, that's a good potential customer then.
I mean, they have to have the pain, they have to have the budget. There's a long list of things that they had to have, right? And if you look at the data, it's just some numbers in particular, like the data industry, I think, is projected to be like 224 billion by 2022 or something like that. And so there's a lot to work with. And then the question is, who within that market is your target and what your budget is.
And I assume that when you build a new category or a new type of product, the communicating that to the market might be a tough thing to do. So, and what I've noticed about Monte Carlo and about you, like you guys publish a lot of content and it seems like it clicks. And at the same time, I see that lots of data science heavy startups, they struggle with communicating actually what they do, with producing that kind of not BS but good content that clicks. So what's your advice or what's your view on the role of the content maybe for a quite technical startup?
Yeah, so we've invested from content very early on because we recognize that we're bringing new ideas to market, and we sort of took sort of two-pronged approach to that for how to do this. One is, and this might tie to sort of things I talked about before, but we really focus on customer pain points. And we write from that vantage point. We're very, very targeted about that. So for example, if we have a conversation with, a couple of customers in the last month and we just realize, oh, they're all struggling with the same pain point. That's something that's is probably shared, right? So, we have a particular persona, a particular pain point, a particular customer in mind when we write this. And we sort of choose it based on what we hear is sort of high priority and top of mind for folks. Like, for example, if folks attended a specific conference and got really excited about a particular talk, why were they excited about that talk? What about that talk, got them excited? Or for example, if we talk to them and we ask them what's your priority for 2021? And, they'll say, they'll describe a very, very particular thing that's on their roadmap that they're working towards. That is something that gives us food for thought on what these people care about. And then we add our own perspective and views on that, but incorporate what we learn from the community. So that's really the first, a very customer specific perspective for the content. And then the second sort of tenet of this is we try to write in a very approachable manner. Like, you know, to your point, like we could make it extremely technical, we could make it very complex, but we actually focus on trying to make it easy to understand, easy to consume. I think in today's world, people are inundated with information. And so we want to make it thoughtful and interesting, but something that can click with people. So, you know, we wrote like about data mesh. You know, without going into all the details of that, it's basically a novel architecture that some of our customers are very excited about. And, you know, we got excited about that too, about that vision and where that's going. And so, you know, we did a lot of research on it and wrote to like clarify the idea and explain how data observability actually is connected to the data mesh. And, you know, a second example is we write a lot about data downtime, right? And again, we could have made it very technical about like, you know, specific sort of schema changes and, you know, different anomaly detection methods. But instead we're focused on the stories and how it impacts people and our methodology. And so we try to do something that's more approachable and something that, you know, you can just start using tomorrow.
And at the early stages when you were just building the followership or maybe the readership, probably the readership is the right word, were you mostly focused on specific technical events and technical audience and you built from there, or conversely you started from and maybe you remain in the business domain and not like data scientists or engineers? So what was the original turf for you to build it out, to build the community?
So the very original actually followed kind of the path that we took to develop the company and the product, which is starting with the not technical, but rather pain point and impact that it had. That's actually the very first blog post we wrote was about, I wrote about my personal experiences with data downtime and how I felt plagued by it. You know, it's called The Rise of Data Downtime. You can look it up on Medium. And that really spoke about sort of a very painful time in my career when I thought I was going to get fired because the data was wrong all the time. You know, and I think, you know, when I shared that with people responded saying like, I feel heard, you know, and that's what we wanted. That's sort of the response that we wanted to get. We wanted to get folks to, we wanted to create empathy and a shared connection around this problem. So that's what we started out with, and similar to, you know, us moving in sort of the chain of kind of developing a company and building each part, we're actually moving to creating more and more content that's focused on the technical aspects and the product, and stay tuned. There's way more to come.
Amazing, and I guess that's really an important not divide, maybe gap between the data science community and technical community and less technical people, and you're bridging this gap. That's really cool. Another community thing maybe I wanted to discuss with you is that really there aren't too many female founders, data science startup especially. And do you think we can make it better, and how we can all make it better?
Yeah, definitely. It's a very big part of my decision to start Monte Carlo is tied to that and to my deep desire to make it better. And so for me, it's, you know, every day I sort of wake up thinking about how do we do that? And I think the best way to do that is for founders to create more positive examples so that more and more people recognize that it's possible and would want to do it too, right? Like, you know, for me, when I get it started, there weren't a ton of examples, right? There still aren't a ton today, but I think the best thing that I can do for female founders is to build a massive business as soon as possible. And so that's what I'm laser focused on. And of course, have many opportunities along the journey to build, you know, a diverse community. I think the data industry is actually very well poised for diversity. There's an amazing diverse sort of candidates, you know, with non-homogeneous backgrounds. So I think we actually have an opportunity to create a new normal for data industry. And so, you know, I definitely wake up every day and think about this, like, how can I build the best company possible? How can I set the best example in my arena? And the way to create this world, I think, is just to create more and more of these examples.
And if we look at the maybe data ops, let's call it widely data ops space, where in your opinion there are or there will be some opportunities for new startups? So you launch this category of data observability, for instance. what are the other interesting spaces that potential founders, especially in female founders, obviously can attack and to look at?
Yeah, so I'm definitely very bullish on the data observability market for sure. Some other areas that I think are interesting or are ripe for disruption is, in particular, data discovery, for example. I think I actually just wrote a blog post about this, released yesterday. It's called "Data Catalogs Are Dead." Long live data discovery. And I think, in many ways, it's obviously a controversial headline, but I think the way in which we've been thinking about documentation and cataloging of data hasn't evolved with the way that we consume and use and build data. And so data catalogs need to catch up with that. And I think we need to basically blow up that paradigm and rethink how to do what we call data discovery. Something that I think a lot about is that, if you think about what's powering all of these movements in data ops is actually metadata, right? So metadata can be like lineage or, information like data quality, all these different, kinds of metadata, you would call it. The thing about metadata is it's actually useless on its own, right? Like take lineage for an example. Nobody cares about like just a map of your assets in particular. It's a great map. You look at it once and you're done. But it's incredibly powerful, lineage and any kind of data, when it's tied to a particular use case. Like, for example, when it's tied to trying to make sure that your data can be trusted, knowing what's impacted downstream when you make a particular change to a data asset in your lineage. That's when the power of lineage really, really comes to life. And so I very much believe in the next generation of kind of products that are aligned around use cases and not in particular things like metadata, for example. Yeah.
I guess that's a very interesting space, and someone with whom I talked recently, he mentioned another interesting category, like process mining, for instance. So things that allow us to discover new things. A lot of low-hanging fruits were picked up, but there are a lot of more, and we need to discover them in data sense, in a product sense, etc. Yeah, very. So
100%.
Yeah. Just to be cautious of your time, probably the last question. What would be the key takeaways that you want people to remember from this podcast, from this conversation? And if there is anything we didn't discuss, but you believe deserves to be discussed, now it's the right time.
Yeah, so I would say, when it comes to sort of, founding a company, I think nothing can sort of replace kind of grit and determination. But at the end of the day, the most important thing is making customers happy. From day one, that's what we obsess about, and it's still the most important thing for us as a company. So maybe that's one thought on sort of building sort of our North Star, at least. And then, what I would say when it comes to data, don't settle for bad data, right? Like stop being okay with bad data. I think data reliability and data that you can trust is actually within your reach with the right approach. And by focusing on automation and observability, it is actually possible to have data that you trust. And I think as an industry, we need to push ourselves to get there.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Barr. Thank you for that talk. And I'm sure we will hear a lot of good news from you and from Monte Carlo as well. Thank you.
Thank you. It was great being here.